Hi, everyone. I'm Garrett Dash Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program with Benjamin L. Carp on the urban geographies of the American Revolution. Before we begin the program tonight, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and the Nipmuc nations. Copley Square, where the Central Library is located, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in the Boston Public Library's collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. And in some cases, the maps don't simply document these stories, they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programs and interpretation, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. And telling new types of history, telling new ways of framing the past through the interwoven stories of people and places is one of the themes of the Richard H. Brown seminar on the historical geography of the American Revolutionary War era, which is the carrier of tonight's program. In the Brown series, we think about how the American Revolutionary War era and the entire latter half of the 18th century is a story not just of great names and battles and speeches and lofty political rhetoric, but also a story of places, ranging from colonial empires that stretched across the globe to new emerging nations, other nations in conflict and struggle, to the towns and villages, battlefields, and intimate spaces in which the revolution took place. Amongst those spaces, of course, are urban areas. And tonight's program, we're inviting you to think about how the cities of the East Coast played a role through their spaces and places in making the context of the revolutionary period happen. The Brown Seminar is part of a larger initiative to document the geographies of the revolutionary period, the keystone of which is our American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or Argo project, an initiative that's supported by a grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission of the U.S. National Archives. Argo is co-produced with the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. And my co-host tonight comes to us. She's the manager of the manager for the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library, Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi there, Garrett. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a delight. Looking forward to it. Yeah, and I suppose I'll take this opportunity too to say a little bit more about Argo, although I won't take too much time. Argo is a multi-institutional online platform showcasing high-quality digital images of maps of North America created in this latter half of the 18th century period, so roughly between 1740 and 1800. As Garrett mentioned, this is being spearheaded by the wonderful folks at the Leventhal Center, as well as the folks of the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, but it is multi-institutional. So we have maps from both of our institutions, but also places like Library of Congress, British Library, as well as upcoming new partners like the Clemens Library, which will be added to the collection later. We are in beta right now, but at the moment we have over 2,000 maps, as well as additional features like a interactive timeline, as well as biographies of map makers and other curated contextual information to help you go deeper with these maps and learn more. And I think it's a lot of fun. I'm biased, I'm extremely biased, but I do think it's a lot of fun, and you should check it out if you enjoy programming like this. Well, today we are very excited to bring you a talk from Dr. Benjamin Carp. Ben Carp is a professor of history at Brooklyn College in the CUNY Graduate Center. He's the author of, in addition to the book, his most recent book, Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, which came out in 2010. There you go. He came prepared. I like that. Previously, Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution, 2007, and most recently we have, and this one I came prepared for, although I realized earlier that my blur filter is a bit too aggressive, The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. He has also co-edited Major Problems in the Era of the American Revolution, which came out in 2014. And his writing has been also published in a wide number of places beyond those works just mentioned, including the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. We are delighted to have you today, Ben, to tell us a little something about your new book and your work in general.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery, and Garrett. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys today. I did not write formal remarks. I'm going to try and keep it loose and explain to you guys how much my intellectual biography has really been shaped by maps and how much my historical interpretations rely on maps. It was actually revelatory for me to go back into my books, especially and seeing how much they depend on maps in so many ways. So I'll briefly introduce my work, and then the part that I'm really looking forward to is just tons and tons of questions. There are more maps I could have shown. There were other images that I could have shown. They told me, why not 12? But I totally exceeded that. But I'm going to show you a fun variety of stuff and give you a good explanation for some of the ways that I'm using it. Boston Public Library was actually probably one of the first institutions I ever did research at as an undergraduate when I was working on firefighting and the American Revolution. This is what my senior thesis was on. And I didn't use a ton of maps in my various work, in my work on firefighters, but that's definitely where I started running across some of these urban maps. And in thinking about institutions like fire companies, engine companies, both public and private, all these different things, thinking about the firefighters as people who protected property. And since property was the foundation of liberty, right, this idea of firefighters becoming politically active in the revolution, sometimes as loyalists, but often as patriots as well, was something that was really interesting to me. And when I got to graduate school and was talking with my mentor, okay, firefighters are this kind of narrow slice of the people who live in cities. But let's think about urban landscapes, right? Who are the other people that are becoming politically active in these urban landscapes? And in another way, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, all right, what were these urban properties that firefighters were endeavoring so hard to protect? Right? When they're thinking about preventing buildings from burning down, or in some cases tearing down burning buildings themselves in order to create fire breaks, right? In thinking about the public good that they're doing, the proper, individual property, but on behalf of the public good, so that other property doesn't catch fire, right? What is it about these seaport towns that really became the fount of identity for a lot of urban Americans? And the cities, of course, I think have disproportionate importance, even though probably only 5% of colonial Americans lived in colonial British Americans lived in cities, and where a city is 2,500 or more people, even though it's only 5%, right? These cities had a disproportionate influence on politics, on the newspapers, on the economy, on the law, on religion, on all sorts of other institutions. And so I began to think, all right, how can I answer these questions about urban politics and urban landscapes more broadly? And that was what led me to the dissertation that became Rebels Rising. And I divvied up that book in a weird way. On the one hand, it was a great way to make chop my dissertation into several bite-sized pieces so that it was a finishable dissertation. This is advice that we still give graduate students: make sure that you can finish it. And so what I did was I picked a certain type of space for each of the 5 largest cities in the 13 colonies and focused on that and explored that site, and then explained how that site worked as a site of political mobilization. So the first site that I can show you here is Boston. And for Boston, I concentrated on the waterfront. You can see how I eventually came to write a book on the Boston Tea Party, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Boston waterfront was chapter 1 of that book, and it actually grew out of my master's thesis. So it was really the first thing that I wrote. Oh, there I am. And so if you look at this map of Boston, right, this is, military map. Many of the best maps of the late colonial cities were done a little bit later after the war had started, often by British engineers and and members of the British military. Here we have Boston, and one thing that you notice about the 18th century. About an 18th century town is they look like porcupines or insects with these wharves sticking out of the city into the bodies of water that helped to sustain these cities. Right, this is where commerce came in. This is where commerce came out. People, goods, information, and ideas. Right, and so looking at the waterfront community, I had to look at maps and addresses to discover that caulkers all lived in the same block, right? And I looked at the places where political activities were taking place. I looked at the ways in which merchants became mobilized, artisans who worked on ships, shipbuilders, in other words, and rope makers and caulkers and sail makers, how they became mobilized, how merchant seamen themselves, right, participated in many of the most famous crowd actions in Boston. And so understanding the waterfront as a distinct space was extremely important to me. And then another map that I used in this chapter that was really important, if you look at the oval, that is Castle Island, right, where Fort William was. It's now Fort Independence, and it is connected to the mainland. But in those days, it's its own island. And at several points, I think 5 times during the Revolutionary period, the Bostonians forced crown officials of some kind onto Castle Island, essentially to exile them from Boston proper. Or crown officials felt so much pressure from the crowd that they exiled themselves to that point. So that included customs officials, the royal governor, the British troops in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, etc. And so thinking about not just Boston itself, but the archipelago around Boston was extremely important to me in thinking about how the distance between Boston and Castle Island sort of became a metaphor in a way for the increasing distance between colonial America and the mother country. And so these are some of the themes that I explored in that first chapter, and it allows me to use some of these, some of the just beautiful mapping that we have for Revolutionary Boston. There are versions of some of these maps, by the way, in the collections of the two institutions that make up Argo, but I did not have time to download separate ones, so I just used the ones that I already had on my computer. In Newport, I'm going to skip my New York chapter for now because I'll have plenty to say about New York in a minute. But for my Newport chapter, I looked at houses of worship. Were religious institutions good places for political mobilization? And Newport is weird because Rhode Island, of course, is part of New England, which is dominated by members of the Congregational Church at that time. But Newport is strange because it's mostly dominated by Quakers and Baptists, but also had very influential congregations comprised of Congregationalists and Anglicans. There were also Moravians, Jews, right? It's a very diverse place for New England, despite only having 9,000 people. So looking at spatial relationships of various kinds within Newport was important. How close were these houses of worship to one another? And what did they look like in terms of their exterior and their interior? Now, these are pew maps for 3 of the churches, but what I really want you to focus on is the difference in form between Trinity Church, which is long and churchly and had a steeple on top of it, and First Baptist or First Congregational Church, which were more Calvinist in their outlook. They didn't call, even though I use the word church here, the people at the time did not call these places churches. They called them meeting houses, right? A church was the gathered community of communicants. But the place where they met in the Calvinist mindset was just a meeting house, right? Just 4 walls. And of course, New Englanders invested these places with all sorts of sacred meanings anyway, but that was something you weren't really supposed to do, right? That making the church building too holy was something that Anglicans or Catholics might do. So again, there's something about the form of these different houses of worship that looks very different from the outside. It's either going to be boxy or long and church-like and having a steeple on top. And therefore, doctrinally, these buildings are making different statements to the landscape about the attitude that they have towards God and community in those spaces. But then if you look at the interior, right, there's a lot of similarity between the way these wealthy urban congregations decorated. And so the the kind of cosmopolitanism on the interior of these places actually draws the congregants in these various houses of worship together. So this is Truro Synagogue, the Sabbatarian or Seventh Day meeting house, Baptist meeting house, and Trinity Church, right? Lots of for people who are into furniture making, etc. in Newport, you can see the craft work that went into making these spaces really beautiful. And so if you were to tour these various houses of worship, you'd find the same kinds of genteel comfort in each of these places. Of course, there's all sorts of segregation going on by class, by race, sometimes by gender in the houses of worship in Newport. So to me, what that says is there's urban commonality inside these spaces, even as there's a kind of war among different churchly forms going on in the streetscape and the ways that you would observe these places from the outside. For my chapter on Charleston, I looked at households, right? Households as places where you work out master-slave relationships between men and women, parents and children, where you think about consumer goods, etc. And one of the houses that I focused on in particular was Rattray Green, the home of Henry Lawrence, who was a slave trader who then gave up the trade and became a merchant in other commodities. He was president of the Continental Congress. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London later on. And his son was John Lawrence, who of course is known from the Hamilton musical, etc. And so if you look in the middle of the red circle, that very distinctive garden-looking shape was Rattray Green. It's where Henry Lawrence moves when he's wealthy enough to afford a kind of suburban mansion like this, rather than relying on the townhouse. And he does it to escape some of the unpleasant things about living in the midst of the city. But the crowds find him anyway during the Stamp Act crisis, where later on he becomes a patriot, but he is the subject of some abuse by the crowd at his home in the early part of the Revolutionary movement. It's fun to revisit this stuff. My chapter on Philadelphia focuses on the State House and the State House Yard. Of course, President Biden made this site famous somewhat recently in the speech that he gave in Independence Square, which is what the State House Yard is now called. In those days, it was just the Philadelphia State House. Now we know it as Independence Hall and a national park site. And one of the things that I found really interesting about this site is Philadelphians used to gather in Market Street at the courthouse and have, and that's where election riots often happened, right near the waterfront, sailors beating up on, Quakers and Germans beating up on each other, all sorts of stuff. But by the 1760s, the Quaker Assembly was like, all right, we're going to build a new state house and we're going to put it on the outskirts of Philadelphia. So is political mobilization going to happen in this new space that's meant to be very Georgian and genteel and and reflect the majesty of the Quaker Assembly and the Pennsylvania governor? They even build a wall around State House Yard with the idea of keeping crowds out. But what I found is all that this wall and this prestigious new place does is lend more of a voice to the crowds who gather in the State House Yard to protest what Parliament is doing. The crowds find their way there. They find their way into this space, and all sorts of interesting politics out of doors happens, literally outside the doors of the assembly rooms and the governor's offices and the council chambers. So again, just looking at the urban landscape, looking at the types of spaces that they built and the way that those spaces shaped politics was something that was really important to me for my first book. For the Boston Tea Party book, I had my own maps made. I think I used one of the maps that I showed already, and then I had 4 maps made. One that showed the wider world, one that showed New England, and then this was the one that was most significant in terms of showing sites that were important to the Tea Party story. So again, understanding which blocks you would have to walk down, the route from the Old South Meeting House to Griffin's Wharf. These were things that it was important for me to be able to show my readers. I was at Tufts at the time, and their GIS lab helped with making this. The other thing that you might notice is the different shadings in the water area. I also wanted to show people the difference between the shoreline as it existed in 1775 and the shoreline that existed, closer to the time of publication, to show how different the Boston landscape looks now. I didn't do that actually for the New York City fire book. We debated it because the shoreline of Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, is quite different now, right? The World Trade Center, for instance, is built on landfill. But I didn't do that for my most recent book, which I will now talk about. So everybody's heard of the Boston Tea Party, but not as many people, I find, have heard about the Great Fire of New York in 1776, when a fifth of New York City burned down 6 days after the British occupied the city. So the British occupy Lower Manhattan on September 15th under General William Howe and Lord Richard Howe. 6 days later, a fifth of the city burns down. And for 250 years, almost 250 years, historians have basically thrown up their hands, said, well, there's no way that the Patriots did it. Washington was so noble. He asked Congress for permission and Congress said no. The American army was 7 miles away. Absolutely no way that this was a deliberate act by the Americans. Maybe it was some drunken British sailor who knocked over a lamp. It was all an accident, and then the wind did the rest of the work. And this disinformation campaign, in my opinion, covered up a lot of the original evidence from British and Loyalist observers who were actually in the city, who insisted and provided evidence in a variety of ways that the Americans had done this themselves. And there's, I don't have Washington dead to rights on this, but there is some strong evidence suggesting that Washington not only thought that the burning of New York City was just peachy, but also that his inner circle did their best to cover up any suggestion that the Americans had done this. So let me show you some of the map things, the geographic ways that I thought about this fire. So in addition to Congress and Washington, one of the people who I blame for creating this distorted history about the fire is a guy named David Grimm, who's often thought of as a kind of kindly old antiquarian in New York City history, but was actually a one-percenter and a city father. And I don't know if one of our organizers today can find the article that I did for the Gotham blog on David Grimm and can provide the link for that. But I go into David Grimm and his interesting status as somebody who was a loyalist throughout the war, but then reintegrated himself into New York City life as a founder of some of its most august financial institutions. And so told a story about the fire that really suggested that the fire was an accident. He gave a weirdly precise figure for the number of houses that burned, 493, even though it was probably more like 800. He also kind of tried to show that the British were really arbitrary in the people that they executed on the night of the fire. So yeah, the British threw a couple of people into burning buildings and bayoneted somebody to death. According to 18th century laws of war, you could kill an incendiary on the spot if you caught them. But again, if you say that the British were being completely arbitrary in the people who they killed, then you can make their punishment look unreasonable and say, hey, they killed a bunch of people over nothing more than an accident. And this map is not the original map that David Grimm drew, but it's one that's reproduced in Valentine's manual in 1866 that then becomes a very influential printed version of this map. And this map and David Grimm's account wind up in almost every local New York City history that mentions the fire in any way. Maybe not the map, but certainly Grimm's account. And what this shows is a contiguous area. There's two contiguous areas because in the lower right part of the city, you can see a little square that burned in 1778. But the bigger area is the area that burned in 1776. And if you can show that as a contiguous area, which all the maps do, you can maybe say, oh, it was the wind blowing flaming shingles that had destroyed the city. And that erases any suggestion that the fire might have started in 10 to 15 places at the same time, right, by a coordinated group of incendiaries, which may well have been what happened, although the evidence, as you might guess, is quite murky. And I want to show you some of the contemporary maps that also show the fire that are not as well known, but are really, really interesting. This is the Ratzer map. This one is pretty well known. There are versions of this map. The one at the New York Public Library is colored in red and is very beautiful. This one is at the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So these are quite nice, but a little bit more common. These are not very well known. This one is in Albany, and you can see that the parts of New York City that had burned during the fire of 1776 simply look erased from the map here in this very dramatic fashion. And that really says something about the British occupation. The British occupied New York City from September 1776 to November of 1783, and they never really got around to rebuilding this area. And so it shows just how shrunken New York City was. It was a town that was that had 25,000 people on the eve of the Revolution. New York City was, some of those people obviously fled in advance of the war, but New York City during the war welcomed refugees, fugitive runaway slaves who had self-emancipated, and other folks. And they're doing so even though the housing capacity of New York City has been diminished by 20%. This map is also quite nice. I had to call people at Alnwick Castle because it's in the Duke of Northumberland's collections. This doesn't show it in as much detail, but yeah, this idea of the parts of New York City that had burned as having been lightened. This one is in one of our hosts' collections. It's out at Mount Vernon. When I gave a talk on the book at Mount Vernon, there was a reproduction of it at the back of the room. So as I was showing this slide, I was like, well, if you turn around, you can see another version of this. But here, the burned parts of New York City are in gray, whereas the rest of the buildings are represented in this salmon color. And I first saw this map actually when it was on tour at the New York Historical Society. And it's a large, beautiful map, but it gave me this information as I got close. And finally, I just want to show 2 out of the 3 maps that William Keegan, a geographer in Connecticut, and I worked on for this book. One of the sources that I used that was new for me in thinking about the fire were the captain's logs, master's logs, and lieutenant's logs from British warships in the harbor. And these are located at the National Maritime Museum and the British National Archives at Kew. And I really wanted to know, okay, all these ships are in the harbor. What did they see about the fire? What did those logs tell us about? Well, first of all, where the ships were, which is how we made this map, but also what time they thought the fire started, what details they had, some of the ways that their own sailors rode into town to help fight the fire, actually. And this is something that a lot of audiences ask about is, did the British help to fight the fire? The answer is yes, they did. And that was mentioned in other sources, but it's interesting to see it in the logs. And then this is the most important map and the last map that I have today. One that shows both the area that burned, but then also it does something that David Grimm's map doesn't. It shows some of the other locations that are not in the burn zone, right? That show where incendiary materials were discovered, where a man was caught trying to light buildings on fire, all sorts of other incidents that show that maybe the attempt to burn New York City represented something geographically wider. And so that there may have been a network of incendiaries at various points throughout the city, rather than just thinking from the maps that this was just a matter of the wind blowing flaming shingles and burning a fifth of New York City by accident. And this map, by the way, is also how Keegan and I calculated that it was probably 20% of the urbanized area of New York City that had burned. Otherwise, there's just a wide range of estimates for how many buildings had burned or what percentage of the city had burned. Some say as little as 1/6 of the city burned. Some say as much as 1/3 of the city had burned down. And there's not even any agreement about the denominator of how many buildings New York City had. Was it 4,000, 4,200? That seems to be the best guess, which might indicate that 800 buildings burned. The places that burned included the Customs House, the Lutheran Church, Trinity Church, most famously, probably the tallest building in town at the time. And then actually much of the other, and some mansions along Broadway, and then a lot of working class housing on plots that were leased for 100-year leases from the Church of England. Working class people who had built their own wooden homes that just in a neighborhood that was, not as Tony, but that went up like kindling during the fire. So I think I've exceeded the time for my remarks, but I wanted to give you this tour of some of the wonderful work that I've done with contemporary maps and maps that I've had commissioned over the course of these 3 books. And I'm really thrilled to spend the rest of the time answering people's questions.
Thanks, Ben. This was fantastic. And I'm glad that I was off screen for that, because I was doing what any good map person would do, which was leaning so close to my screen to look at your maps that I would have made a kind of ugly picture on
Yeah,
video.
I could have done more close-ups, Mr. DeMille, but yeah.
I was doing something similar, and I will say, just to plug Argo again, many, though not all, certainly not all of the maps that Professor Carp presented, the contemporary maps, are available on Argo. And so if you want to zoom all the way in and squint heavily at your own computer screen, you can do that at your leisure.
Great. Well, just to remind our audience, we very much welcome questions from our listeners today. If you're logged in on either YouTube or Facebook, you should be able to enter a question in the sort of chat thread, and we'll get to them as they come in. But we're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes with Dr. Montgomery and I sort of having a conversation with Professor Carp about what he's just led us through, as well as some other ideas and topics from his books. And then, we really we want to know what you all think. We can bring Professor Carp's presentation back on the screen at any time if we want to look at those maps, or even perhaps pull Argo right up on the screen if we want to look at some others. So, Alexandra, I'll let. Do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start with a pretty broad question, which is, could you tell us a little bit about what these early American urban spaces were like? You showed us some great maps, but I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about, what did these spaces feel like? What were they defined by? And sort of how were they sort of maybe like or maybe unlike the urban spaces we're familiar with today?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I tried to do this work in the introduction to Rebels Rising. I also did it with, a lot of work that I did in the appendices. To the thing to start with is, well, how big were these cities, right? Mm-hmm. Philadelphia, the biggest, has 40,000 people. Newport, the smallest of the 5, had 9,000. And the suggestion is that most of the other cities in the 13 colonies towns really were even smaller than that. So, I mean, there are college campuses with more than 40,000 people today, right? And so they're tiny. I mean, when I was thinking about the Boston Tea Party, right? Boston, a town of 16,000, right? And thinking about, well, were these Boston Tea Party guys anonymous, right? And the way I think is, you think 16,000 people and fewer than a quarter of them are adult men, right? You knew how your neighbor walked or his cousin carried himself, even if he's in one of these kind of fake Mohawk disguises. Everybody knew who these guys were. And yet the Boston Tea Party and its participants remained secret for 50 years. That says something about Boston, both how intimate these spaces were, even though there are strangers and new people coming in and out of them all the time, farmers bringing their goods to market, seamen who just stepped off a ship, etc. Even though there is a level of anonymity as we're accustomed to in cities today, they still would have felt pretty intimate as far as the people who lived and worked there year round. I mean, I really emphasize that the cities are experienced differently depending on your social position, right? There are some spaces where women or poorer people or people of color would not have been welcome. There were ways in which the wealthy tried to segregate themselves in their carriages. Even in thinking about a church, right? The wealthiest people would sit in the foremost pews, and Black worshipers might be relegated to a separate upper gallery. Right. And so there are all sorts of ways in which it was important to me throughout to think about urban geography. Look at the ways that the commercial wharves and the market districts are so central in each of these cities. Where are some of the other places located? Right. Are there ethnic neighborhoods? It doesn't seem so necessarily. Are there class stratified neighborhoods? Maybe. Urban geographers really seem to dispute that. What I tended to find is that you just find a lot of mixing, right? A lot of opportunities for people from different walks of life to come across one another. And to me, that makes political action a lot more interesting, right? That clearly the revolutionary movement was not just top down, with Samuel Adams pulling all the strings in Boston, but a negotiation between him and ordinary folk in Boston. Right? They had to live among one another. How did they inspire one another to political action? What levers did they each use in trying to join together for revolution?
Ben, if I can follow up on that, I'm curious, what would be your answer to the question of how the various differences amongst cities that become part of the United States give rise to different sort of relationships to the imperial crisis. We Bostonians tend to fancy this sort of like characterological study, like we just hated tyranny so much, right? And we were so brave and so patriotic. But if you were to sort of set aside that like story of great ideas, like what was it about this? All these cities were small. All of them had spaces for mixing. All of them had, at least seaboard cities had port districts. What was it about Boston versus New York versus Philadelphia versus Charlestown that created these regional differences in the period?
Yeah, this is really tricky. I mean, one of the weaknesses of my book maybe is that I tried to show that there was a kind of commonality to urban political mobilization, but I tried to do that by having each chapter be on a completely, a different type of space within a completely different type of city. And so, I was trying to be attentive to the particularities of each city and, and the contingencies that, led to the specific narrative that each of these cities had, while trying to make the book add up to here's an urban experience, and the ways that seaports helped to facilitate a certain type of politics. So this is really tricky. I mean, Charleston, obviously, with its importance as a slave port and its large Black population is different, right, from the other cities of mine, all of which were north of the Mason-Dixon line. So, in some obvious way, right, it might make more sense to compare Charleston to Kingston, Jamaica, right, or Bridgetown, Barbados, right, that comparing it to a North American city might not even be appropriate, except for the fact that South Carolina, obviously, is part of the 13 colonies and doesn't stick around in the British Empire. Philadelphia and its dominance by the Quaker Assembly means one thing. Boston, with its relatively homogeneous Congregationalist population, means another, right? So there were two books, prominent books on taverns, right, before my book came out. One was on Boston, one was on Philadelphia, and they really emphasized, Puritans, restricted tavern growth in some ways, Quakers restricted tavern growth in others. In New York City, they don't care about any of that. They care about making money and drunken sociability, and so New York City becomes a particularly interesting place to look at taverns. And I think I talked already about how Newport is just such a weird place in so many ways. So like, I really did lean into the distinctiveness of these places. I wouldn't say it was a kind of like, the character of, of each of the cities. I just don't think most people think that way anymore. But at the same time, right, like if there were particularly dominant economic functions or religious groups, I think that, especially among the people who made the big decisions in these cities, I think that did have an effect. Were these places more homogeneous, more heterogeneous? That matters in thinking about how big a hill you had to climb in order to mobilize your neighbors on behalf of the resistance to Parliament.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the subject of your most recent book, the Fire Book. In your book, you get into sort of the why, if, as you hinted at in your presentation, the city was deliberately set aflame. Why would a person do that? What would be the goal of that? Why would you even say these things about George Washington?
Why would anyone do such a thing? I thought I could. Let's see. Well, I mean, the reason is, right, you've got an army, an American army that's mostly composed of New Englanders. I mean, strategically, right, Washington has three choices as the British are coming. He can try and fight the British and have his army wiped out. He can abandon the city and leave it intact for the British, or he can burn it behind him and deprive the British of a naval base, of a winter garrison, a town, of a market for loyalists to begin bringing their goods and potentially returning to British allegiance, right? So there are lots of good reasons to get rid of New York City. And then there were emotional reasons among the rank and file too. The British had burned Charlestown, Massachusetts, Falmouth, Maine, Jamestown, Rhode Island, two of those sites in sight of Boston and New York. The British had started cannonading Norfolk, Virginia, and then the Americans burned the rest. But the Americans still blamed the British for that one too. Norfolk, by the way, was the sixth largest town in the 13 colonies. So there were, so you have an army that was out for revenge. New Englanders really thought New York City was very loyalist. Maybe not true, but they thought, oh, it's a Tory town, and and we're glad to be rid of it. There may have been some targeting of wealthy people's property. There may have been some discomfort with the red light district that was burned during the fire among some of the New England officers who had been stationed in New York City from April or even earlier to September. So there were a lot of reasons why people might have wanted to, and then the Church of England, right, is also a target, and New Englanders also had an animus against the Anglican Church. So those are a lot of reasons, both in terms of strategy, but also, let's say, emotional reasons why the American Army might have wanted to wipe New York City off the map.
Historic New York-Boston rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, and Washington, right? He's, he says like, the only thing I have a problem with is that more of it, is that enough of it still remains for the British to make use of it, right? Like his biggest problem was that the fire didn't finish the job.
Yeah, but of course it doesn't. New York remains, and it remains a British base for the rest of the war. So how does this fire impact this loyalist British establishment that takes hold in New York when, as you say, maybe up to a fifth of the city has been destroyed?
I mean, the short answer is it exacerbates the housing crisis, right? You have a lot of people who need places to sleep, who now, where it's now going to be that much more difficult. Because the fire didn't really destroy the really important shipyards and commercial districts and printing houses, right? Like it doesn't do as much damage as it could have. And as far as British military movements, they were supposed to attack Paulus Hook on the 21st. They delay that by 2 days, right? So as far as like wider strategic things, it's hard to see what consequence the fire had. If it had been a more successful fire, it would have had more severe consequences, I think. But that's not the fault of the arsonists. That's they tried their best, in my opinion. The wind just shifted direction, and and those other more valuable parts of the city weren't able to catch fire.
Great. Well, why don't we start turning to some questions from the audience? Again, as a reminder, you can chime in at any time on YouTube or Facebook to ask a question of Professor Carp or from the three of us. There's a question here from William de Giacomantonio, who asks, what was the revolutionary movement's leadership's cartographic literacy? Is there evidence that, quote, urban agitators consulted maps at all in coordinating activities?
That is an excellent question, and honestly, something I didn't consider, but it's generating all sorts of interesting thoughts, right? Like in the same way that we have to understand that, like in earlier periods of history, people weren't necessarily literate, right? And so how important oral culture and rhetoric was, right? Like sometimes we read these 19th century speeches, and we don't get like how powerful oratory was in earlier eras, right? In a way that doesn't necessarily come off the page, but like they don't have television, right? So you will stand there and listen to somebody give a speech for an hour, and you will be absolutely riveted by a stem winder of a speech. You can still see some elements of that today. I've seen George W. Bush speak in person. I've seen Reverend Al Sharpton speak in person, and you get it, right? When you see somebody with that kind of rhetorical skill. In the same way, one thing that we sometimes forget is that not everybody has access to these kinds of maps. In military situations, we understand that they do, but most people oriented themselves, from the kind of street view on Google, right? Of like turning 360 degrees and knowing, oh, I'm in the Old South Meetings House. It's this way to get to Griffin's Wharf, right? Or something like that they wouldn't have necessarily had the bird's eye view that we get on our, when we're using GPS or, or consulting a paper map. And so it's a good question. Would anyone have even needed a map if they lived in New York City or Newport, and we're only talking about places that were 2 miles wide max, and you could walk, you could spend your free time, if you had any, walking these streets and really getting to know them in your bones. That's not possible in a place like Berlin these days, right? That's just or New York City for that matter, especially if you include the outer boroughs in that equation, right? Like you could walk your whole life and still not feel that you had mastery of the entire landscape, but you might well have had that view. I mean, we know that that people involved in shipping, right, and that pilots really had to know the harbors. We know that in erecting fortifications that military people really needed to know about these maps. But it's not clear that, let's say you were a census taker, you would necessarily have needed a map to do your job in the colonial era, that you would just go block by block or that would be subdivided, that responsibility would be subdivided under several people, and the maps might not have been necessary for your job. Locals do not need maps. It's the people, miles away, right, who are going to be coming to these places in an unfamiliar way, or making decisions about these places that were unfamiliar to them. They were the ones who needed maps, and not necessarily the people, the urban inhabitants themselves.
Ben, if I can ask a follow-on question sort of about your practice as a historian.
That's a good question.
Which, something that we wrestle with all the time and always encourage people to think about is the way that the sort of legacy of maps that have been left to us, and particularly the ones that have been kept, almost universally tend to sort of show the view from power, right? It's military engineers, it's surveyors, it's people who have power who are making and circulating maps, and the kind of spatial experiences of ordinary people aren't always captured in them as well.
Yeah.
Which is why I love the vernacular
understanding of. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm a New Yorker. We show we're listening by interrupting. Having a vernacular understanding of maps would be fascinating. I mean, what some historians try to do, like Chris Minty, who has a book on New York Loyalists that's about to come out, is by thinking in terms of network analysis, right? Mm-hmm. If you're, let's take a wine cellar and look at all of his clients, right? And you can kind of reconstruct what would have the spatial world of that retailer have been based on the customer that was the customers that were coming into his store, and if a lot of them were loyalists, what does that say about this person's social circle, right? So I think there are ways for historians to do this. What we would love to find is a kind of scribbled homemade map, right, that was done by some ordinary shoemaker or something. But in terms of urban things, those are very hard to find. I think what's better known to historians are some of the maps made by indigenous communities that show their own very different ways of understanding spatial geographies. For cities, I think there's real potential for coming up with things like that, but it would be through textual documents, I think, and then the scholar, the geographer, or the historian then generating a map on the basis of those types of documents in order to kind of get a vernacular understanding of the city. I mean, one example, if you read like Jill Lepore or Serena Zabin or Peter Charles Hoffer on the fires in New York City in 1741, right? What they have to try and imagine is what was the working geography of enslaved people in 1741, the taverns where they hung out, the ways that they gathered to bring water, to fetch water for their employers, things of that nature, right? I've seen hints at people trying to do this kind of thing. I know Simon Finger is working on a book on pilots, right? What were their knowledge of harbors, right? As not necessarily coming from a place of power, but having a certain leverage through their geographic and cartographic understanding. I think that kind of work is fascinating, and that there's probably more of it we can do.
And I love your use of like church floor plans, or you mentioned looking at the ship's logs of the ships that were in New York Harbor. And to me, those are amazing examples of kind of geographic or spatial thinking, even though the document you're not looking at is not maybe a map in the traditional sense, but you're trying to suss out how did people experience these different types of spaces. So
yeah, and maybe I could have been more self-conscious about that, right? I mean, this discussion's been fascinating already.
Yeah, for literary scholars, everything is a text. For geographers, everything is a map. Embrace it; it's beautiful. And maybe this is a question that maybe both for Ben and for Garrett. How would we think that those maps that are drawn from this more vernacular perspective, how would those look different? Because I think it's really easy to imagine, especially now in sort of an omnipresent era of Google Maps, that a street map looks like a street map. What could possibly be different about it? So what might we see? What might look different if we were able to create these more vernacular maps?
We would be able to see connections among people. We would be able to see priorities of people who maybe were more disempowered in the social and political hierarchy. I think there might be all sorts of potential.
As I was looking at the sort of negative space maps, that show the burned area, it's fascinating, right? They weren't actually just like, become terra nullius, right? Like surely people were still in and amongst the rubble, and
Canvas Town is what that neighborhood was called. And I didn't, everybody asks about Canvas Town and when it was repaired. I didn't actually do that much on that in the book. And what's really interesting is in the 19th century, you'll have historians say, it's kind of a shame that the fire didn't burn more of Lower Manhattan, because that's the rat's nest, part of the city. This is post 1811. Like, look at the beautiful grid that we're building in the rest of Manhattan. Everything could have been neat and orderly if we just, if we'd been able to start from scratch, right? And so there's this kind of fascinating, and so interestingly, right, and there's a sort of disdain for, here are the people who lived in that area before. Isn't it great that it became gentrified later? So again, from positions of power, deliberately erasing spaces can also be a power move.
And you're talking about that makes me think, of course, of the Great Fire of London in the 17th century, which becomes the sort of excuse to completely redesign the city in this exciting, brand new, logical Enlightenment kind of lines. Which then sort of brings me to another thing that I've been thinking about as I've been sitting here, which is the sort of ubiquity of fire in urban spaces. To my mind, it seems like every urban space has a story about the Great Fire, the Big Fire, sometimes multiple fires. Am I correct in thinking that fire is sort of this quintessentially urban experience in this early era, or am I just making stuff up?
According to Daniel Immerwahr of Northwestern, who gave a talk for us at the CUNY Graduate Center earlier this semester, it's a uniquely American thing, right? In Europe, they had already cut down all their trees, and so they built, sensibly out of brick and stone. Right? In America, we've got all this timber. And so well into the 19th century, we just build of wood. And so we're building, matchsticks essentially that go up again and again. Colonial New York City had actually been quite lucky in not having a major fire that burned an entire neighborhood until 1776. Boston, Montreal, Charleston, South Carolina had all had big neighborhood-sized fires. But New York City, despite relentlessly building in wood, and they actually tried to pass a law in the 1760s saying, let's build out of stone and brick going forward. And the carpenters were like, no, we need, you'll throw us all out of work. So New York had just been lucky, really. And then this fire happens. But I mean, this is a product of, all these beautiful trees, in North America that could be chopped down and built into frame houses. So, which isn't to say that, Edo or Tokyo and London and, and other places hadn't also had major early modern fires. Obviously the technology of being able to throw water, gets a lot better, as things go on. There's a David Garriott, who teaches at Monash, I guess, in Australia, has done some really interesting work on, why didn't Paris burn, for instance. He actually breaks it down here were the fire prevention efforts that Paris had engaged in that prevented Paris from having a major fire of the type that London had had.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, again, it's funny. I'm not a pyromaniac, but fire and firefighting turned out for me to be a really interesting window into history. And so I always pay attention when I listen to other people doing interesting work like that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we have another audience question, which will probably have to be our last question for the evening. It comes from Vanessa Janes, and Vanessa asks, I love how these Pew maps and the idea that they are making a doctrinal statement on the landscape. How much of that statement could have been understood from the exterior, and who was that statement for?
Yeah, I mean, I found quotes here and there, a member of the Church of England calling a Congregationalist meeting house a raccoon box, right? Sort of disdaining other churchly forms. And of course, right, the idea of having a bell or a steeple, right, would have been completely anathema to most Calvinists, right, at that time. Right, and so there are all sorts of examples of of people remarking on these churches. Of course, the churches weren't totally exclusive. One of the hobbies that people had in those days was, let me visit other churches and see how good their minister is and things like that. So people weren't just experiencing these spaces from the outside. They would visit on the inside and notice some of these differences. But yeah, you'd be able to tell, certainly, right? I didn't show you elevations of each of the churches, but the difference between an Anglican church and a Congregationalist meeting house would have been quite plain, right? The absence of a bell and a steeple in particular, right, would have been, very, very evident, right? This is a Congregationalist statement that, we are dissenting churches, we are doing something different. Later on, right, there might be more similarities, as you get into the 19th century, and as you have different types of churches, evangelicals, Mormons, Catholics, emerging in the American landscape. But in the 18th century, right, the fights among mostly English but some German-derived churches were plain in the landscape, in my opinion.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much, Ben, for joining us here for this talk. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, this is. I wish I'd left even more time for questions. It was really fun.
Never enough time for questions, in my opinion.
Yeah, Ben, it's a real pleasure, and I think it really it's a perfect illustration of the sorts of conversations that we want the Argo project to invite people into, right? It's not just to see these maps and to realize that they're there and realize that they're beautiful, though they certainly are beautiful, but to think about these questions about space, about geography, about how people in the late 18th century inhabited and inhabited spaces and went through the process that led to the American Revolution. So as a reminder, Professor Carp's books, including his most recent on the New York Fire, are both available for purchase and, of course, in your wonderful local library to check out as well. On behalf of the whole Argo project, Dr. Montgomery and myself, Ben, I want to thank you. Also note that at the Leventhal Center, we have a month of online programs coming up, including on June 7th, Blake Gumprecht on his new book, North to Boston, Life Histories from the Black Great Migration in New England. For more book talks, online and in-person events, as well as visits to our gallery and programs for researchers online, you can visit our website at leventhalmap.org or follow us on social media at BPL Maps. Ben, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
And this program, as with all of our programs, will be available online on YouTube as soon as we've concluded the broadcast. You can find it as well from our archived event page. Thanks to the audience for listening and for your excellent questions, and we'll see you at the next Argo seminar.
Thank you.